Hey everyone, I hope that you're doing well. Thank you so much for joining me once again on another video. In today's video, I am going to be answering a question or a series of questions that I've been getting asked quite a bit lately as a result of some of the journal episodes that I've been doing. So about a year ago, I purchased the Fuji XF10. It's an amazing, amazing little camera. It's obviously it's my opinion, and it's an opinion that contrasts a lot of the popular opinions here on YouTube. A lot of people have really hated on this camera so much, but I absolutely love it. Yeah, it's just a really awesome camera to journal with. I began to journal my life with it. If I didn't have a paid shoot, I would just literally hit the streets and I would take this camera with me. And it's so easy to record video and pictures with it. And so I started a journal series. If you haven't seen that, I'll leave the link here. And people went out and bought this camera, and a lot of those people have been asking me questions. I think that there is a lot of value in today's episode. It's a type of episode that I haven't done before, so I'm gonna approach it kind of like a podcast, in where I talk and I share with you all of my settings, and I'm gonna be quite thorough. And as I share my settings, I will answer other questions that I get asked, things like Fuji recipes and shooting JPEG or RAW, the autofocus on this camera, the snapshot focus, the zone focusing on this camera, all kinds of other stuff. But more importantly, today I'm going to be talking about approach. I'm going to kind of split today's video into three sections. I'm going to talk about approach and why I think approach is the most important thing that we need to be aware of whenever we take any camera out to shoot. Two, I'm going to talk about what I call pre-shoot settings. These are settings that I set up on my camera before I go out and shoot, and I rarely, if ever, change them while I'm out on the field. And then three, I'm going to talk about what I call accessible settings. And these are settings that I need to access very, very quickly when I'm out shooting. And with all of that being said, let's just go ahead and jump into today's episode. It's long enough as it is, so let's just go ahead and jump into that. Let's talk about approach. So my approach for the XF10, just like my approach for most of my cameras, is I think about it like a digital representation of the film process. So I'm going to turn the camera on, and I'm going to press the Q here, the Q button, and that's going to open up my quick menu. Okay, for me, this is the digital representation of my film stock. So if I was shooting film, I would take my camera and I would choose a film stock, and while doing so, I would choose my ISO and I would choose the look that I want. Do I want a Fuji look, a Kodak look? Do I want, you know, black and white? So this is what I call pre-shoot settings. And so, especially for those of you who want to shoot JPEGs, and I'm going to talk about that now, this is where you would bake in your recipe. Now, one of the things about the Fuji XF10 that is not a problem for me, but if you're a JPEG shooter, it might be an issue for you, is in a lot of Fuji cameras, they allow you to set up different Fuji recipes and to set them to custom 1, custom 2, custom 3. And so I personally don't, even when I have my custom settings in my other cameras, I set my quick menu before I leave my house. And that is just my approach. It is my philosophy. When I'm out shooting, the picture is more important to me than the preview. If you look here at my menu, you will see that I have it set to RAW and Fine JPEG. I only shoot the RAW files for my portfolio, but I do use JPEGs because sometimes I want to post photos from my day on my Instagram stories, and I find that the JPEGs using this recipe here are quite good, and then I just transfer it over to my phone using the Fuji app, which, by the way, on this camera works exceptionally well. And so I connect it to my app, and then I just upload the straight out of camera JPEGs onto my stories. And so that is what you're seeing here now. So highlights -1, shadows -1, color -1, and then I shoot in Astia. My noise reduction is low, and I don't do anything to sharpness. Sometimes I will shoot in classic chrome, but Astia and classic chrome, I'll be honest with you, I haven't changed this for probably at least 3 months, possibly 4. I just leave this and I don't mess with it. I shoot 90% of the time in Aperture Priority. That's what that A stands for. Okay, and whenever I shoot in Aperture Priority, I set my ISO to Auto 6400, which means that the camera will choose the appropriate ISO to give me what I need between 200 and 6400. Whenever I shoot in manual, if I were to put this in manual mode, then I would go into the ISO and I would pick whatever ISO I want it to be at. But I'm going to leave this in Aperture because that's what I shoot with most of the time. All right, so this is my pre-shoot settings. White balance is always an auto. For those of you that shoot JPEGs, in my opinion, the tint on the white balance, on your custom white balance, is what has the greatest effect on your film recipes. So you choose a recipe like, for example, classic chrome, and this would give you the contrast and the saturation. So you can't go into the tint on the quick menu, but what I've done is, this has a really awesome feature. I can take the focus wheel, or the wheel here around the lens, and it'll activate my white balance. And so if I do that, and then I go into there, I can change the tint, and I can give it like a very green, very blue, or very yellow, if I want that vintage look, yellow look. Okay, and so I'll make a video about Fujifilm recipes and using custom profiles or custom recipes later. But for the most part, this is what I use all the time. I don't change this ever, especially when I'm out shooting. The ISO, I do want to say one thing about the ISO. The ISO, every once in a while, I will find myself in a situation that's low light, where the low light capabilities of this camera is pretty good, I have to say. But every once in a while, I will put it into 12,800 ISO, but most of the time, I just leave it in auto. Now, we've talked about approach, and we've talked about pre-shoot settings. All right, so now I'm going to talk to you about the accessible settings. These are the settings that I need to access pretty quickly. The Fuji XF10, the design of this camera, makes it very easy for me to have access to those settings. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over the very basic ones first. I feel like these don't really need an explanation, but I'm going to do it anyways. So you have a mode dial here, and it's got a bunch of mode dials, which are really cool and really fun. But to be honest with you, I don't use them. I only use 2 of these. I use manual, and then I use aperture. And out of the 2, I primarily just use aperture most of the time. So that just stays there. Then you have your shutter button, which obviously I'm going to be using that quite a bit when I'm out shooting. And then there is a wheel around this shutter button, and this controls the aperture. I don't really mess with this very often because on this camera, I shoot at 2.8 most of the time. Unless I'm doing a landscape, then I'll set it to 5.6 or f8, or unless I'm zone focusing, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And so, yeah, most of the time, this is just set to 2.8. With a lens this wide, I find that shooting, at a certain distance, it gives me just the right amount of depth of field. And when I get really close to a subject at 2.8, it gives me just the right amount of background separation. So this just stays at 2.8 most of the time. This wheel here, however, this I use probably the most. This controls, if it's in aperture priority, it'll control exposure compensation. If it is in manual priority, it'll control your shutter speed. So usually what I do is I shoot with -1 on exposure compensation on this camera. And so I don't mess with it a whole lot, but sometimes if a subject is backlit, then I do have to adjust the exposure compensation. Now let's talk about the accessible settings that are maybe not that obvious. And I'm going to hit the display button and hold on to it here at the bottom, and it's going to give me this menu, which Fuji calls a function setting menu. Once again, I'm calling it the accessible settings because of the ones that I have to access. So here it gives you a diagram of the camera. There is one physical button at the top. There is another physical button right here on top of the Q button. And then the rest are all swipe gestures. So you swipe on the screen, swipe up, left, right, and down. And that may sound like gimmicky, but it's actually really, really useful. I would dare and say that the XF10, the swipe gestures on here are much easier to use or feel better to me than my XE3. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into these settings and why I use them. These settings, to me, combined with the approach, can make the difference between having a positive user experience or a negative user experience. So let's go ahead and open this up. Okay, the first accessible setting that I'd like to share with you today, I have assigned it to the function button here at the top. So if I press the top, what it does is it gives me the flash mode. And right now the flash is on, and it's there's 4 different modes. There's flash, there's slow sync, there's second curtain sync, commander mode, so if you want to set another flash, and then there is just suppressed flash, which means the flash is off. Whenever I need this, I just go like this and then I go there, because typically I like to use slow sync flash, and when I want to get it off, I just do that. So it's very, very easy to access. The second accessible setting that I'd like to share with you, I've assigned it to the black button above the Q button. I press that and it gives me the autofocus modes. Now, this is something that I assigned to this button when I first started shooting with this camera. To be honest with you, I don't need it. If I turned off that button, it wouldn't really make a difference in my shooting style, because after using this for a year, I always shoot with wide tracking on this camera, always. So it has zone and it has single point, which it gives you all of these points. But like I said, I always use wide tracking, and wide tracking, basically what it does is the camera selects what it thinks should be in focus. So I just go like this. And then I'm going to talk about autofocus speeds right now, because people ask me about that quite a bit. So it just selects whatever it thinks. So if I go like this and I half press, you will see that it's thinking that the board there on the shelf should be selected. So what happens if I want to select something specific? I could go into the menu and I could go into single point, and I could go in and then just use the joystick. But I find that that just takes a little too much time. So what I do is I leave it to wide tracking, and then right here on the right top corner of the screen, there is a little rectangle that says shot. You can leave that to off, and if you leave it to off, you could press the screen and nothing will happen. But I have it on shot, and what shot does is, let's say that I want the XF10 to focus on the lens in the bottom, then I just press that and it will override the wide tracking. If I want this to be in focus, it'll do that. So if I'm holding the camera like this and I'm shooting with my index finger, which I sometimes do, then I could just go like that. And that is a really awesome feature. I've heard people complain about that feature, but I find it to be quite useful when I use it in conjunction with wide tracking. Also, down here on the bottom, it says AFS. I find that on this camera, shooting an autofocus single yields the quickest results. So I never touch this. I never put it in manual focus. I never put it in continuous, always in autofocus single. Okay, and now let's talk about autofocus just for a quick second, because I know a lot of people are curious about that. The autofocus on this camera, in my opinion, is quite good. The difference is, like right now, we are in a low light situation. Okay, so we're in my room. I don't have a lot of lighting here, but it focuses just fine. I think what happens with this camera is it uses the system where it goes back and forth and then it locks on, where most modern cameras don't do that. They jump from point A to point B, as to where this one goes from A to Z and then ends up in, like, I don't know, M. And so for some people that's a problem. I find that it focuses fast enough. All of the pictures that you've seen in my journals episodes were shot with this setup, exactly the way that it is. Oftentimes these people were moving, so I find that it is good enough. If you ask me, the autofocus is good. Okay, all right. Let's go into, we have 4 more settings that I want to share with you, 4 more accessible settings that are really important. And these we access with the swipe gestures. The first one is the shutter type. So if I swipe, it's the way I have it set up, from right to left, it gives me my shutter type. This is something that I need to access whenever I'm in bright sunny conditions. So the mechanical shutter will give you a top shutter speed of 1/4000th of a second. And sometimes that's not enough in bright conditions. Another thing with this XF10, as well as with the X70 and at least the original X100, I don't know about the X100F or the X100V, but these have a leaf mechanical shutter. So they're really, really quiet, which is amazing. And the problem is that with a leaf shutter, it won't allow you, Fuji cameras, at least these 3 models that I have, won't allow for a shutter speed of over 1/1000th of a second if my lens is wide open. Now, if my lens is at 5.6, I can go up to 1/4000th of a second. If my lens is at 2.8, it'll only allow me to go at 1/1000th of a second. Obviously, at 2.8 and 1/1000th of a second, even at ISO 200, I'm going to overexpose everything. And in the beginning, I thought there was something wrong with my camera. So the workaround, and once again, this comes down to approach, right? Philosophy, right? If I let that throw me off, then that's going to be a problem for me. So for me, what I do is I just put it in electronic shutter. When I put it in this mode where it activates the electronic shutter, you can see here at the bottom, it will give me a shutter speed of 1/30th of a second all the way to 1/16,000th of a second. I've never needed that fast of a shutter speed. I mean, maybe I'll try shooting into the sun one day. And then it's good, it'll activate, it'll be good from 200 ISO to 12,800 ISO. So this is something that whenever I'm in sunny conditions, even though this doesn't have an ND filter like the X100, I can put it in electronic shutter, and that works really well for me. And whenever I'm in low light situations, I don't need that fast of a shutter speed, so I just leave it in mechanical shutter. The second accessible setting that I want to share with you, I have it assigned to swipe right, and that is flash compensation. And this is really, really awesome because I love the flash on this camera. So if I want to turn the flash, I turn it on slow sync, and sometimes I want the flash to be more powerful, and sometimes I want the flash to be less powerful. And so this flash compensation is really, really amazing. I use it. I wouldn't say that I fiddle with these settings every time that I go out, but sometimes I want to get that point and shoot look with a flash, like that reminds me of like the pictures that I had when I was a kid, and so I use that. Okay, all right. The next accessible setting that I'm going to share with you is the one that I use probably the most, mainly because on this camera I shoot a lot of video, and this is not a camera where I would like do cartwheels because the video is so great. Like I wouldn't shoot a Netflix original with this camera, but the video for journaling, it's perfect. It's a perfect journal camera. And someone would say, well, why don't you just use your iPhone? The fact that I shoot the stills and the video with the same camera is really easy for my computer to keep organized, and I have a chronological order, a chronological visual journal of my day. And so especially when I'm editing videos for YouTube. So the video function is really awesome. I hit drive and now I'm in video. I hit drive and now I'm in stills. It's very, very quick. Now, the swipe down feature gives me the ability to change my frame rates. And this is something that I wish that my other Fuji cameras had. I wish that my Sony cameras had it. I don't have any really new cameras, so so maybe the new ones have this option. Maybe the new ones let you access frame rates in some type of function menu, but none of my cameras do. This is the only one that I own that allows me to access frame rates. So for example, let's say that I'm out and I'm shooting video, and right now it's at 24 frames a second. And I want to shoot something, and I think it's something that I'm going to want to do in slow motion. I swipe down and then I go into 60 frames a second, and then I could slow that down in post. And this is just for journaling. This is perfect. If you're curious as to the quality of video that you can get out of this camera, watch my journal episodes. A lot of those are recorded on this little camera. The last feature that I'm going to share with you, or the last accessible setting that's important to me, is zone focusing. Now, I've already been very clear that I think the autofocus on this camera is solid. But this camera has a feature that allows for zone focusing, and I hadn't really zone focused in a long time. And since I got this camera, just because the feature is there, it's kind of inspired me to try zone focusing. And so, so I'm going to share that with you. The Ricoh GR has this. They call it snap focus. Here they call it snapshot. And I have it assigned to swipe up. So if I swipe up, okay, it sets it into snapshot 5 meters. And basically what that does is it turns off the autofocus. And then, so there's no, it's not going to hunt back and forth. What it does is it sets the aperture to 5.6. And then it sets the focal distance in a way that pretty much anything, if you have a subject that is standing anywhere, it looks like here, it looks like it's anywhere between 11 feet and 30 feet, they're going to be acceptably sharp. This is the 5 meter mode on snapshot. If I swipe up again, it puts it to 2 meters. And when it's at 2 meters, what it does is it changes the aperture to f8. And then anything, it looks like it's anything between 5.5 feet to 8 feet, possibly even 8.5, is going to be in focus. So I find that this is a very useful, for my style of shooting. I do get quite close. And so I find that this is a very useful distance, 5.5 feet to 8 feet. There are times where I wish that this had a closer, like it has a 2 meter and a 5 meter. Sometimes I wish it had a meter setting, but it doesn't. But for those, I swipe up and then I just use the autofocus, which is just fine. So those are all of the settings that that I use on my XF10. I hope that you've been able to extract some value from today's video. Thank you guys for watching. Have a wonderful week or rest of the week, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.